in loving memory of Giuditta, Giuditta Favero, nee Elena, born August 6, 1901, at rest December 9, 1973, Mass at St. Anthony Church, interned in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Giuditta Favero was our landlady at 110th and Edbrooke when my folks brought me home from the hospital. And we lived there for 2 years. And she had 2 sons, Dominic, Nino Favero, and John Paul Favero. And her husband's name, I think, was Pete Favero, and they were both from Italy. She was a wonderful woman. I loved her. I loved her like a grandmother. That's why I thought so much of her, I guess. I don't know. She had a wonderful vegetable flower garden in the backyard, and she was a wonderful cook, and that's where I got my love for gnocchi and all kinds of Italian food, I guess, because she was from Italy. And she was just a kind, very kind person. And she was very good to my mother and my father. And I guess they had really adored her. She had a big brown dog named Tippy. Nino opened a pizza place on the hill at 111th in Michigan. And he made wonderful pizzas. And then they moved to 111th just west of Cicero in Worth, Illinois, which is about 20 minutes from here. And he opened his restaurant there. And that restaurant is still there. And it's run by his son. When I went there a few years ago, I don't even remember who I went with, but I went to the counter and I spoke to him and I told him, I knew your grandmother and I loved her very much. And I guess she was tough with them because Nino had 9 children. So yeah. Anyway, that's all I can tell you. She came to the wedding at Holy Rosary because that's the church that she belonged to, even though it was Holy Rosary Irish. And that's something I don't understand. I don't understand why she didn't go to St. Anthony, which was an Italian church. But I have no clue. And both Nino and Johnny are gone, so they couldn't tell you. It's too bad that one of them isn't alive because Johnny was very well educated and he would have been able to have a nice conversation with you. I know I went over there one time when Julie was about 1.5 years old, and we sat in the kitchen and talked, but I can't remember what we talked about. You know, I mean, that was 50 some years ago, 50 years ago. So, you know, she was just a very sweet, kind, and she had an accent, but it wasn't too bad of an accent that I recall. And, you know, my mother and father, when they were young, they would have their social life would be that my mother's friends would come over or my father's friends would come over, like Josie and Bernie Van Brussel and Tana Frida and Uncle Carl Milkerite and I can't remember who else, but they would go and, you know, take turns going to people's houses for a late supper on Friday night or on a Saturday night, I don't remember. And she must have been very friendly because they all liked her very much. She was a very nice woman. Well, it wasn't everyone, it was just one couple that would come over and they would have a cold supper, a luncheon meat and cheese and drink their beer and sit at the kitchen table and yep. And then my father and whomever, either Uncle Carl or Bernie would go in the living room and they would watch TV, and my dad would sit in his easy chair and the guys would sit on the couch, and then next thing you knew, they were all unconscious sleeping. The guys, you know, the guys would lay on the couch and fall asleep, and my dad would put his head back on his chair and he had his footstool, so he was good. And they'd have a little snooze while the ladies were in the kitchen yapping. I dug up a rose bush from her yard and I planted it in front. And then when I got the plant that I have there now, I moved the rose bush over by David's little side, right by my, sidewalk. And I have to go and check if it survived this last summer. I haven't looked, but she loved her flowers. But anyway, we lived on the second floor, but before we lived there, Aunt Rose, I think maybe it was afterwards that we lived there, but Aunt Rose and Uncle Harry lived there. No, it had to be afterwards because I remember my Aunt Rose babysitting me, and I had to stay overnight and I had to sleep with them. And then when I was a little bit older, I slept on the couch, I remember, by my Aunt Rose's. So I must have been a little bit older, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Every time I think of her, every time I go up to Michigan Avenue on 111th, I look over on Edbrooke and say, I lived there. My folks were very social. They had lots of friends, not only the people that were German, but the people that lived in Pullman. Josie and Bernie. Josie lived on Champlain, where Jeannie Lira, where her house is. And they lived with Mrs. Kroll. No, Mrs. Strobo. Mrs. Strobo, that was Josephine's mother. And Joe had a sister Marge and a brother Steve. And they all lived on Champlain there. And they were not Ukrainian, they were not Polish. They were something Slavic. I don't know if it was Czechoslovakian or not, but during when they were young, my grandmother Mary and Mrs. Strobo and Mrs. Berger, who also lived on Champlain. I don't know if it was Mrs. Berger, but I'm pretty sure Mrs. Strobo didn't know how to read or write. So when she would get letters from her family from the old country, my grandmother would read them and read them to her and write back. And that also was with any people that were at the Ukrainian church. So my grandmother was a good person too, and she had a lot of friends. But I don't understand how, God Almighty, how did they ever survive, those women? Like you were saying, I mean, she had 6 children, 3 of them survived. They didn't have any heat. They had back then they had a coal stove. They had to iron everything that they washed because otherwise it would be wrinkled, because there was no wrinkle free at that time. And there would be rope lines in the kitchen, and that's where they hung their clothes in the winter. And my mother did that when we lived on Langley when I was very young. Then they got the washer, the automatic washer with the wringer, and they still had no dryer, so they would have to hang the clothes either outside or inside in the kitchen. But as far as Nino, he opened a restaurant also at 111th, just a little bit west of Michigan Avenue in Roseland. And that was a very nice restaurant. And I know you all did not like my wallpaper that I had here and here, here and here, but that's where I got the idea, because he must have bought it from Vanderwalt, who was on 115th Street, and Mr. Frigo was the manager at that store. So when I went there, I said, "Oh, I want that for my kitchen." Look how beautiful she was. She was beautiful inside and out.